Michael and Richard have described.
But one of the chief preservations of the system we want to preserve, of democratic capitalism, if you will, is the ability to be suspicious of the government, skeptical of its moves, and have access to redress. How is that possible and still have comprehensive privacy?
You know, that's a great question, because you can say, well, we need to do network security for our national government. And then you could say, you know, what would a closed society that doesn't value individual rights or have a constitutional democracy do? And then you could say, you know, what would a country that believes in the rights of individuals and balances in power do? And you'll probably come up with two different solutions. So I think we need to be asking ourselves those kinds of questions. We think, for example, it's a little paradoxical, but we think transparency and openness is very important. You need some accountability. If the government says we're going to take these steps and we need this authority, you need to ask yourself, well, who's going to be on the other side assessing those decisions, evaluating those decisions?
Now, that's a very interesting area you brought up because, Richard, you're indicating we really need a private-public combination here, that the private sector needs to get involved. The private sector, in some ways, has more rights of privacy than the government does. It can withhold more information about what it's doing. How do you walk this line?
Look, the problem is that the government has discredited itself in the last decade. The trust, if we had trust in the government before then, I think a lot of what's gone on in the last decade has eroded that trust. The cyber command that's being stood up is NSA. And unfortunately, it's the only capable organization the government has to deal with cybersecurity. The Homeland Security Department, and the Secretary is going to be here in a little while to talk about it, is beginning to build capability, but they don't have it. NSA is the wrong organization to defend the private sector. It's the wrong organization to defend anything.
They don't share well.
Except, well, they do some things very well, and that's the problem in some respects. They're the right organization to defend the military, the wrong organization to defend the private sector. The problem is, right now, no one is defending the private sector. And the theory of the Obama administration seems to be Cyber Command defends the military, DHS, which can't do it yet, defends the .gov domain, and the rest of us are on our own. That's not going to work.
I think that's the paradox of the challenge you have between people who don't want the government involved and those who recognize the government has not just unique capability, but has access to insight about what the threat is that is not available to the private sector. The question is, how do you build an architecture that allows a sharing of information and a coordinated response? But I think Marc's point is good. You don't want to necessarily have the government literally sitting and operating the internet and opening and closing doors, because it's not hard to imagine a situation like you have in other countries where someone makes a decision that the threat isn't just an attack from a botnet, but an attack from ideas that the government doesn't like. So the key is to build a system that allows a sharing of information that does put on critical infrastructure a responsibility to maintain itself, because if one part of the network fails, the whole network fails. But preserves a certain gate between them and a certain amount of accountability so that the government can't simply just run roughshod over the private sector. And that's been a hard thing to architect. Unfortunately, government sometimes responds to hard questions by avoiding them, and I think we are overdue to have the discussion, complete the architecture, and start to implement it.
Well, the key here, I think, is exactly what you both said, which is to have somebody else do it. The government can establish guidelines. It can say that we want authentication, but the government shouldn't be the one that does the authentication, and it shouldn't require it on every network. But it should facilitate it. When it comes to screening traffic on the backbone, a lot of the problem would be solved if the Tier 1 ISPs were required to do deep packet inspection. But we can't have the government doing it. Right now, the Department of Homeland Security is building this thing called Einstein 3. That's not something that we can port into the private sector. But we can tell the ISPs by regulation, and regulation's a dirty word in Washington, but we could, by regulation, tell the Tier 1 ISPs, you have to do deep packet inspection for malware. As long as the government itself isn't doing it, then I think we can avoid some of the privacy.
You're okay with the ISPs and the phone companies doing this kind of thing?
No.
Well, there you go.
I think we have to go. I think we have to be careful if we go down that road. I mean, certainly telephone companies have always had the right to listen in on their lines to ensure quality and to improve service. There's no absolute prohibition against a communication carrier having access to content. It's very well understood. But we've had a lot of difficulty, I think, over the years keeping that sharp boundary between, service delivery and content filtering, or getting access to content for even advertising purposes. Because the truth is, deep packet inspection opens the door to commercial opportunity. Now you know a lot about your customers that you didn't know before.
Depends on what you're doing with the deep packet inspection.
Well, yes, but you see, this, of course, is the problem, because the companies can say, well, we have to do this because of our security mandate. Oh, by the way, here's a market opportunity, and maybe we should be pursuing that simultaneously.
Yeah, but you can do deep packet inspection without looking at content. You can look for signatures.
Well, yes, but I think what I said at the outset was that if we go down this road, we really have to be very careful, because you see, one rationale easily collapses into another, and what began as a fairly good security technique will open the door, I think, to
well,
so there's a role for government. There's a role for government, which is to make sure that when the ISPs do deep packet inspection, they're only looking for signatures.
Right.
Have government do inspection. Have a private organization
So it could be
do
audited.
inspection.
Yes, but you have to recognize it's easy to talk conceptually. The actual writing of the rule set that draws that line is very, very difficult. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do it, because I agree. I think you want to have a capability to look at what is moving over the network, and the only way to do that is to do the deep packet inspection. And maybe you need to make sure the organization that does that is not the same organization or is ring-fenced from people who market. Right. But writing that rule set is tough, and then, of course, inevitably there'll be some unanticipated circumstance. You then get into the issue of liability. I know, Marc sues telephone companies, and then that right away
ISPs
freezes
too,
everybody. ISPs too, and that freezes
equal opportunity.
everybody. Yeah. So I think that you probably have a fair amount of agreement about what the challenge is, but you cannot underestimate the difficulty of translating that into really writing the specifics. At the end, though, we still come back to this point. Saying it's hard, and therefore let's talk about it for another 2 or 3 years, is exactly the wrong answer.
When you get taken out in 90 minutes, it's kind of a problem. Now, I'm a little intrigued here, because we're talking about these as kind of civil, structural, or procedural issues. Richard, you started out by saying the tools have failed. People have been hacked. Yep. Is the stuff good enough and it's just not being applied correctly? Is that what y'all are saying?
No, the stuff is obviously not good enough. But
what needs to be done?
So what we're looking at are for architectural solutions that don't rely on every company doing everything right. To say to every company, you have to have all your patches up to date, you have to have all of these systems, it's not going to happen. Therefore, you want to look for ways further up the food chain that you can have some effect. And one thing that you can do, and unfortunately it involves regulation, and unfortunately it raises privacy concerns, one thing that you could do that may be a 60% solution, that makes it a lot easier on individual enterprises, is to require the Tier 1 ISPs to do some sort of inspection for malware, with appropriate regulation, with appropriate public transparency. That's a step in the right direction.
But I also want to point out one of the things, when we get into these discussions, they tend to focus on network defense, which is obviously important, but there are a couple of other vulnerabilities. There is the hardware and the software that we use in our systems, much of which is devised or written in other parts of the world and can have embedded within it vulnerabilities or flaws. And then there's, of course, the people who operate on the system. One of the questions I ask audiences, when you get a goodie bag at a conference like this, and it has a thumb drive, what do you do with it? Well, I throw mine out. But a lot of people go, wow, it's free, let me stick it in the computer, and who knows what they've stuck in with it. So you've got to start to write rules and have protocols that recognize that human beings are on the network, and you have to be able to deal with that security vulnerability.
Marc, you want to say
something? Well, I wanted to say two things. I mean, I think one, solution to this problem that wouldn't involve so much government involvement is some high-level certification program within the industry to really push, the private sector to establish credentials, to do what Richard thinks needs to be done to raise security awareness. But I'll tell you something else, because every time you say DPI, I sort of feel like I have an opportunity push back a little. The folks over at NSA are not just interested in looking for malware. They're very interested in content. They're very interested in
That's why they can't be the ones who are